Every story leaves something behind. A whisper, a shadow, a question that was never answered. Here we dig through the forgotten files, the unsolved mysteries, the chilling true crimes, and the horrors people wish had stayed buried. From haunted legends to real-life nightmares, every tale is pulled straight from the horror archives. So turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and step carefully, because once a story enters the horror archives, it never truly leaves.
The first story tonight was sent in by a listener who went to say goodbye to a family member and found someone else waiting instead. This one is called The Viewing That Ran Late. It's a quieter kind of disturbing, the kind that makes you doubt what you saw long after you've left. The casket was open when I arrived, but the body inside wasn't my grandmother. I stood in the doorway of the viewing room, holding a bouquet of white lilies, staring at a face I had never seen before. A woman, maybe 70, with rouge caked too thick on her cheeks and lips painted into a faint smile that looked almost deliberate, almost mocking. The funeral home was called Hargrove & Sons. It sat at the end of a long gravel road outside of Colebrook, New Hampshire, surrounded by old birch trees that had lost most of their leaves. The building itself was Victorian, white clapboard with dark green shutters, and it smelled the way all funeral homes smell, that strange cocktail of flowers and chemicals and carpet cleaner that never quite covers what it's trying to cover. I checked my phone. I was at the right place, the right time. The sign on the little brass stand outside the viewing room read Margaret Ellison, my grandmother's name, but the woman in the casket was not Margaret Ellison. I walked to the front desk, but no one was there. The little brass bell sat on the counter, and I rang it twice. Nothing. The hallway stretched out in both directions, dimly lit with those electric candle sconces that are supposed to look warm but just look cheap. I could hear something, faint music from somewhere deeper in the building. Not funeral music, something older, a hymn maybe, but played on what sounded like a music box. I walked toward it. I don't know why. I passed two more viewing rooms. Both had their doors slightly open. Both were dark inside, but as I passed the second one, I glanced in and saw the outline of another open casket, and someone standing beside it, just a silhouette, perfectly still, facing the casket. They didn't turn when I passed. I found the office at the end of the hall. The music was coming from inside. I knocked. The music stopped. A man opened the door, mid-50s, thin, wearing a black suit that looked a size too large. He smiled at me in a way that was technically polite, but didn't reach his eyes. I explained the situation. Wrong body in my grandmother's viewing room. He nodded slowly, like I had just told him something very boring, and said he would look into it. Then he asked me to wait in the front parlor. I waited for 40 minutes. When I walked back to the viewing room, the casket was closed. A different attendant, a younger man, met me and said there had been a mix-up with the preparation schedule. He apologized. He said the correct arrangements would be ready by tomorrow morning. I asked him who the woman in the casket had been. He looked at me for a moment, then said they didn't have any other viewings scheduled that day. I told him about the person I'd seen standing in the dark room. He said I must have been mistaken, that both adjacent rooms had been empty and locked all afternoon. When I came back the next day for my grandmother's actual viewing, everything was normal. The right body, the right flowers, the right silence. But as I sat in the front row and looked at her face, something small and wrong crawled into my head and wouldn't leave. Her lips, they were painted into that same faint smile, the exact same one I had seen on the stranger's face the day before. I told myself it was just the mortician's habit, just the way they did things at Hargrove & Sons. But I looked at old photos of my grandmother after the funeral. She never smiled like that, not once in her life. And whoever had been standing in that dark room, I never did find out who they were. The next story comes from someone who took a night job at a funeral home in Louisiana. He thought the worst part of the job would be the bodies. Turns out the worst part was what happened to one of them. This one is called Night Shift at Deveraux. The emergency call came in at 2:15 in the morning, and the voice on the other end was already wrong. It was too calm, too measured, like someone reading from a script they had rehearsed many times. They said there was a body that needed to be picked up from a residence on Calloway Street, and that the family had specifically requested Deveraux' funeral home. I was the night attendant. I had been working there for 3 months. Deveraux was a small operation in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, tucked between a laundromat and an insurance office in a strip of buildings that all looked tired. The embalming room was in the basement. The floors were concrete, and no matter how many times we mopped, there was always a faint pink tint in the grout lines near the drain. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, and the air always felt 10 degrees cooler than it should have been. I drove the van to Calloway Street. The house was dark, except for one window on the second floor. No cars in the driveway, no lights on the porch. I knocked on the front door, and it swung open on its own. Not dramatically, just an inch or two, like the latch hadn't caught. I called out. No answer. I pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The house smelled stale, like it had been closed up for a long time. Weeks maybe. There was mail piled on the floor beneath the slot in the door, a thick layer of dust on the entry table. I found the body in the living room, an elderly man, seated in a recliner, facing the television, which was off. He looked like he had been dead for a while, more than a day at least. His skin had that waxy, sunken look. His mouth was slightly open, but here's what bothered me. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, perfectly, like someone had arranged them. I called the funeral home to confirm the pickup. My boss, Mr. Deveraux, answered. He sounded groggy. He said he hadn't dispatched any calls that night. He told me to check the log. I told him I had received a call on the business line at 2:15. He went quiet, then told me to come back to the home and that he would sort it out in the morning. I drove back with the body. I brought him down to the embalming room and placed him on the table. Standard procedure. I filled out the intake form with what little I knew. No next of kin provided. No name given on the call. I wrote Calloway Street John Doe on the tag. I went upstairs to finish some paperwork. Around 3:40, I heard a sound from the basement. A single heavy thud, like something falling off the table. It happens. Bodies shift as gases move. I didn't go down. I didn't want to. About 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Then a third time. But the third time, it was followed by a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across concrete. I sat at the desk and didn't move. The dragging stopped. Then I heard the basement door creak. It was at the end of the hall, maybe 30 feet from where I sat. I stared at the hallway. The door was open about 6 inches. I knew I had closed it. I always closed it. I left. I got in my car and drove home and called Mr. Deveraux and told him I wasn't feeling well. He said he understood. When I came back the next afternoon, Mr. Deveraux met me in the parking lot. He said the body was gone. The table was empty. The intake form was still on my desk, but the tow tag was missing. He asked me if I had completed the pickup correctly. I said I had. We checked the security camera in the basement. The footage from 2:00 a.m. to 5:00 a.m. was corrupted. Every single frame. Mr. Deveraux never mentioned it again. I quit 2 weeks later, but I still think about the phone call, the voice that was too calm, and how it knew to call Deveraux specifically. Because that number, it wasn't listed anywhere. This next one was submitted by someone who worked as a custodian at a funeral home in Ohio. During his time there, he found something hidden in the building that probably wasn't meant to be found. He calls it the room behind the chapel. There was a door behind the altar in the chapel that wasn't on any floor plan. I found it on my second week working as a custodian at Green Lawn Memorial, a mid-sized funeral home in Dayton, Ohio. I was sweeping behind the heavy velvet curtain that hung along the back wall of the chapel when my broom handle caught on something, a seam in the paneling. When I pushed on it, a section of the wall gave way slightly, revealing a door with no handle, just a latch recessed into the wood. Green Lawn Memorial was built in the 1940 and had been renovated at least 3 times since then. The chapel seated about 60 people and had tall stained glass windows that turned the afternoon light amber and green. It smelled like old hymnals and wood polish. The carpet was burgundy, and so thick it swallowed the sound of footsteps. I asked my supervisor, Dale, about the door. He looked at me like I had said something offensive. He told me that door led to an old storage room, and that it had been sealed off during the last renovation. He told me not to open it. He said it firmly, looking me right in the eyes, and then he walked away. Naturally, I couldn't stop thinking about it. For 3 days I went about my work, cleaning the viewing rooms, vacuuming the hallways, polishing the brass fixtures. But every time I passed through the chapel, I looked at that curtain and thought about what was behind it. On the 4th night, I stayed late. Everyone else had left by 8:00 p.m. I went to the chapel. I pulled back the curtain and pressed the latch. The door opened inward with a sound like a sigh, releasing air that was cold and stale and carried a smell I couldn't place. Not decay exactly, something chemical but old, like formaldehyde that had been sitting in a sealed space for decades. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet. No windows. The walls were bare concrete, unpainted. There was a metal table in the center, bolted to the floor. It looked like an old embalming table, but smaller, narrower, and on the walls there were photographs, dozens of them, pinned directly into the concrete with small nails, black and white mostly, though some had yellowed to sepia. They were all photographs of the dead, close-ups of faces, eyes closed, mouths slightly open. Some looked peaceful, others didn't. Some of them looked aware, like the photograph had been taken at the exact moment between life and death, and whatever was behind those closed eyelids was still looking out. But the thing that made me step back toward the door was the table. There were leather restraints bolted to it, 4 of them, wrists and ankles. The leather was old and cracked, and stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. There were grooves worn into the metal surface of the table, long scratches in parallel lines, like fingernails dragged across steel. I took a photo with my phone. The flash lit up the room for half a second, and in that half second, I saw something I had missed. In the far corner on the floor, there was a small pile of personal effects. Rings, watches, a pair of glasses, a set of dentures, things you would remove from a body before preparation. But these weren't in any labeled bag or container. They were just heaped in the corner like discarded scraps. I left the room. I closed the door. I pushed the panel back into place and let the curtain fall. The next morning, Dale was waiting for me when I arrived. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me. Then he said that one of the security cameras had flagged motion in the chapel after hours. He asked me what I had been doing. I told him I was finishing up some cleaning I hadn't gotten to. He stared at me for a long time, then nodded. That afternoon, I went back to the chapel during my break. I pulled back the curtain. The seam in the paneling was gone. The wall was smooth and unbroken, freshly painted. The smell of latex paint was still hanging in the air. I checked my phone for the photo I had taken. It was still there. The table, the restraints, the scratches, but the walls in the photo were bare. Every single photograph was gone. Someone had gone into that room between midnight and noon and removed every piece of evidence except what was bolted down, and they had sealed it back up like it had never existed. I still have that photo on my phone. I look at it sometimes, and I wonder who those people in the photographs were, and whether all of them were dead when those pictures were taken. This last story is the one that kept me up after I read it. It was sent in by a former apprentice embalmer from a small funeral home in rural Georgia. The family brought in a body and told the staff not to look inside the casket. They should have listened. This one is called What Happened to Samuel Morrow. The family asked us not to open the casket and wouldn't tell us why. That should have been the end of it. But I was an apprentice embalmer at Whitfield Funeral Home in rural Georgia, and my mentor, a man named Curtis, told me to open it anyway after the family left. He said he needed to verify the condition for the burial certificate. The way he said it, I could tell it was a lie. Whitfield Funeral Home was a converted farmhouse on Route 19, about 12 miles south of Americus. It had been in the Whitfield family for 3 generations. The embalming room was a converted root cellar with low ceilings and a drain in the center of the floor. The walls were painted white, but had gone gray from years of moisture and neglect. It always felt like you were underground, even though it was technically ground level. The single window was painted shut and covered with a sheet of opaque plastic. The deceased was a man named Samuel Morrow, age 44. The death certificate said cardiac arrest. The body had been transferred from the county hospital. The family, his wife and his mother, had brought their own casket, which was unusual. They had paid in cash, which was also unusual, and they had been insistent, almost aggressive, that the casket remain closed during the visitation and the burial. Curtis waited until 10:00 p.m. He told me to come downstairs. I followed him to the embalming room where the casket sat on the rolling stand. He handed me a flathead screwdriver. The casket wasn't an off-the-shelf model. It was handmade solid pine with iron hardware that looked old. The screws were set deep. It took me several minutes to get them all out. We lifted the lid together. Samuel Morrow was inside. He was dressed in a plain white shirt and dark trousers. No shoes. His hands were at his sides. He looked like he had been dead for the appropriate amount of time. But there were several things that were wrong. First, his fingernails. They were black, not bruised. Black like they had been dipped in ink or stained from the inside. The discoloration ran up into the nail beds and spread slightly onto the surrounding skin. Second, his mouth. It had been sewn shut, not by us, and not in the way funeral professionals do it. The stitching was crude, done with thick black thread in uneven loops, like someone at home had done it with a sewing needle. The thread was pulled so tight, it puckered the skin around his lips. Third, and this is the part I still can't explain, his eyes were open, just barely, thin crescents of white visible beneath the lids. But the eyes themselves were wrong. The irises were too large, almost entirely filling the visible space, and they were a pale gray color that didn't look natural. They didn't look like the eyes of a dead man. They looked like the eyes of something that was waiting. Curtis leaned in close. He studied the body for a long time without saying anything. Then he straightened up and told me to close the casket and put the screws back in. I asked him what was wrong with the man's eyes. He didn't answer. I started replacing the screws. I had gotten 3 of the 6 back in when I heard a sound from inside the casket. A faint wet click, like a mouth opening. I stopped. Curtis was standing by the door. He had heard it too. He was looking at the casket with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was fear. He told me to finish. I put the remaining screws in faster than I've ever done anything in my life. My hands were shaking. When I tightened the last one, I heard another sound, a single slow exhale, muffled by the wood, long and steady, like someone letting out a breath they had been holding for a very long time. Curtis walked over and put his hand flat on the lid of the casket. He held it there for about 10 seconds. Then he removed it and told me to go home. He said the burial was scheduled for 6:00 a.m. and that the family had requested no funeral home staff be present. He said we should honor that request. I went home. I didn't sleep. At 7:00 a.m., I drove past the cemetery on Route 19. The grave had already been filled in. The dirt was fresh and dark. The family's truck was gone. There was no headstone, no marker of any kind. I went to work the next day, and Curtis acted like nothing had happened. I brought up Samuel Morrow once, about a week later. Curtis looked at me and said that name had never been on our intake log. I checked the records myself. He was right. There was no file, no death certificate copy, no payment receipt, no record that Samuel Morrow had ever been in our building. I drove back to the cemetery the following weekend. I walked to the spot where I had seen the fresh grave. The ground was flat and undisturbed, covered in a thin layer of grass that looked like it had been growing for months. I still work in the funeral industry. I transferred to a different home in a different state, but sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the prep room, I think about Samuel Morrow's eyes, those pale gray crescents staring out from a face that was supposed to be dead. And I think about that exhale, that long, patient breath from inside a sealed casket. And I wonder, what exactly did we bury that morning, and whether it's still down there?
And that's where tonight's file closes, but the archives are far from empty. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more horrors, mysteries, and true crimes hidden in the horror archives. Until next time, keep the lights low, keep listening, because you never know what story we'll uncover next.